Okay, we are live. I got the eyes of God fixed under me. Um, there's been a lot of seeing with eyes. Talk about the eyes of God or God watching. Um, I've been making a bunch of connections throughout Genesis towards what we're going to talk about today, which is Moses and what he's doing. Um, what he's manifesting, and I chose the eyes of God as my intention because well, there's a bunch of things going on. Like I'm getting a little bit frustrated with what Matthieu is doing, um, at least in the way that he's framing time and space, and I got this sense that time and space are fruits. Um, so they're added on in some sense. But that's too big for my small mind to comprehend. But that's maybe something I hope to discern when watching to what occurs here from the perspective of God, whatever that might mean. Um, One of the things that I associate with this is in Genesis 1, day 1, we're talking about light and darkness, right? So that's where we start. We're starting with light and darkness. And they, in my mind, in my reading, and this is going to be on my channel later, that has to do with the establishment of land. The light shines on the land that allows it to be land. Um, so, yeah, um, in some sense, the question is, what are we serving, right? Like, how do we organize the things that we look at, right? This has to do with our purpose. And the question is even, right? Like, and I think when we're talking about my church purpose, like it's not him talking about God, right? He's talking about Genesis and symbolism, and it's maybe good to keep that in mind. So the eyes of God, Castle also talked about this, that God is in the clouds watching the Egyptians, and there's something with how the perspective of God or the being of God or whatever we want to call it is speaking through the events. And what I want is I want to add that onto what we're talking about, because I think it will flesh things out, like it will give them more of a body, and it will give us a handholds how to relate to that. Also, don't try to do what I'm doing because it will flood you with information, associations, and all of that stuff. It's like that's where I've been living. Um, yeah, Christopher, you want to go next?
Sure. I have written out here, having, being, becoming established. Um, yeah, the what Will was saying there with this being about the patterns in creation. Genesis is very much about the cosmos becoming established and how that pattern repeats throughout the rest of Genesis and Exodus here. And yeah, just think how you can apply that looking at there's a lot of people who look at things as, just having wished that something has been established already and not looking to establish something going forward. And so I'm just looking at those kind of three different perspectives on how these things of Moses play out here. Castle?
Sure. So my intention today is lending a hand. So I'm going to take sort of a support role here in this book club session. There's a lot of stuff about hands. I mean, we talked the other week about as far as trees go. You know, you've got the grasping and wrapping around of a snake, but then you've got the what would you say, the embracing of roots down in the ground, and also the aspect of the branches kind of branching out and catching light. And so we had a bit of those elements. Now we're going to see a lot of stuff related to Moses's hands and Moses being God's hand. In many ways, there's a lot of hands. So I gotta hand it to Matthieu Pageau for this chapter, and you can look forward to a lot more things like that. Danny, I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure what to say about chapter 64. I was pretty lost in I think the high level snake thing. I think as I started to read ahead more, things started to come together. So I think I need more time. But I really was interested in a lot of the subjects coming up. At the end of this chapter, there's a very dense and powerful image that Manuel and I had talked about for a while, a couple weeks ago. And I guess I've been contemplating on Manuel. Manuel has a perspective on this, which obviously he'll get to hopefully and unpack. I'd like to hear, but I've been reflecting on the past and what it takes to basically come to gain an understanding of that. If that, I don't know if that's very clear, but I guess as a group I've known some of these people for a long time, and we've done many things together. And as Manuel and I had this conversation about this image and the things that are packed into it, I've just been a lot in reflecting on how ways of thinking and perceiving have changed over the last several years. So I guess that's just where my head's sort of been. And then as far as the next chapter goes, if we get there, chapter 66, sickness and disease, I'm excited about that subject. But anyway, again, sorry, that wasn't very coherent, as I'm all over the place today. So I'll just stop right now and hand it back to Manuel.
Mark, did you go?
No, I didn't
Sorry,
go
Mark.
yet. I can go. That's fine. Yeah, I think for me, this particular set of chapters really, but this chapter around, let's say, the idea of the staff and the snake and waters and flooding and how things come to be, which is an engagement with a manifestation that is ours, guided by guided from above, from an emanation. And I think that's where I want to say primary confusion, but it's one of the sort of confusions of today. It's sort of related to my live stream that I did yesterday, where it's easy to fall into this idea that, well, there's nothing to do because it's all decided for us. And one of the things that the miracles of Moses chapters here are supposed to be explaining is the fact that you're guided but not told what to do. And it's that gap that everyone has a problem with. And so they either go into, well, we don't know what to do, and it doesn't matter what we do because it doesn't make a difference, right? Or they go into, the world is predetermined, right? Or some variation of that. And maybe they have 64,000 names for the variations, but actually it's the same thing. You can call it predestination or predetermination or determinism or whatever you want. You're actually referring to exactly the same thing with no difference. And the fact that you can put more spin on it or more flavor to it doesn't change the fact that there's no difference. But what this is, what this is actually designed to show you is that it is a cooperation and interaction, right, between, or a co-manifestation, if you will, between the highest and the lowest. Right? Although we're not the lowest, but something lower, right? And that's where all the magic actually exists. So that's sort of the context I want to give, because I think by giving that context up front, it will solve a lot of problems as we go forward. That's it. Back to you, Manuel.
Yeah, so I think we need to reference back to this throughout, because I think it's important. I have my notes here, wall of text, more wall of text. So, and part of my wall of text is that I see these spaces that got created, and there's a lot there, like, because it's also speaking about the nature of the space that is created, the way that it's created, the way that people relate to it, right, and the way that God relates to the space, and so I wanna I guess float around it a little bit, right, so that we can see all the perspectives and say, okay, right, like this is where there is agency, right? Because there's parts where there is a constraint, right? But there's also parts where there's freedom, right? And if we look at the constraints, we can't see the freedom, and if we look at the freedom, we can't see the constraints. It's like, okay, cool, right? But like, one of the nice things from Paul van der Klee is like, okay, we have the right eye, and now we have an eye patch on the left, and the opposite way. And it's like, if you want to look through both eyes, you need to change something, right? Because you're not going to be able to look through both eyes and be able to maintain this rigidity of perspectives, right? So you need like a fluidness or a participatory manner to engage with your perspective, right? Which might end up manifesting in a poetic manner. And yeah, some people had this idea.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight this.
And we're doing prophecy now.
Horribly clever. Well, with this book, prophecy, no, never. It's not full of it or anything.
Yeah, well, yeah, like so the integration is like pulling things together, right? But there's also something like holding the space, right? Which is literally what Moses is doing. He's holding a space. And this connects back to the containers, right? And then when we have an established space, we are constrained, right? Like we're bound to that space unless we break it. So with those words, we can start at the first sentence of the chapter, which is Moses cast the staff to the earth and it became a snake. So there's a bunch of things going on. The first thing I want to point out is that we're talking about an action, right? So we're casting, like casting a die. What does it mean to cast a die? Well, you're letting loose of something and you're giving it over to fate.
Right.
Or what Moses does here, right? He casts the staff onto the realm of earth, right? Onto the dominion of earth. So he's holding it, right? Which means that it's in his dominion. And then he gives over the dominion of the staff to the earth. And in the dominion of earth, it becomes a snake, right? So what does it say about the staff? Well, it says about the staff that who's deciding what the staff is makes the staff behave in a certain way and everybody else towards the staff, right? Because it's not only that Moses, well, I guess in this example it is, right? But in the future example, it's not that only he's looking at the staff, but there's also onlookers, right? And they witness this happening, right? So there's a truth that is shared, right? So the staff becomes a focal point of the participation, right? Like it's literally holding the space of the shared attention and the narrative that gets established, right? And so when the staff is on the ground, right, you can look at it as like, okay, the staff is in the domain of the earth. So what will happen to the staff, right? Will the pharaoh go and pick it up? Who will pick up the staff? Because it's a question, right? Like it's literally something that needs to be established in the future, and everybody's in doubt about it, right? Like, and that's the unpredictability, right? And when we're talking about a Kairos moment, right? Whoever picks up the staff is the one who puts a spin on the wheel, right? He's establishing his dominion, right? Because his agency will manifest the future step. And so you see that at the next bit, right, is he seized it by its hand and it became a staff, right? So he's reestablishing dominion. Now the functionality of the staff changes, right? Now it becomes a walking stick again, right? It can take him to the pharaoh later on. And apart from the physical symbolism that Pageau is talking about, right? Like, I think the attention thing is the important part.
Right. Also, I want to point a few things out. So, one way to look at this is to say he is giving up control of the staff, right? But he's also giving the staff down to the earth. And in giving up control of the staff, we'll say another force takes over control of the staff, and it's not somebody else, right? But it is the power, if you will, that comes from above that turns it into a snake, which, of course, there's all kinds of interesting symbolism there to dive into, right? But it just turns out that he has control of this snake when he seizes it, right? Which, again, like, you can tie that right back in, right, to the whole snake thing, right? And so the snake was, in essence, cast down and no longer has control. We have dominion over snake. So this idea of giving up control, but giving down the material item, and that material item manifesting as, sloppy term, power, that I think is the important part of that sequence. I think that's why, right? So in your giving up of something, you actually gain the power and the control, in essence, because you're giving up control by giving it down to the earth, in essence, where it belongs, and then you can seize that control when you need stability, we'll say, and that's what's that's what's establishing you as a mediator of the world. And that idea of mediator of the world is that co-manifestation I was pointing at earlier.
I want to add just a couple of quick things to that as well. So and some of the stuff is kind of obvious stuff that we've already had before, but I just want to point out that the vertical staff is also acting as a pillar. So it still has a point in the earth, but it's acting as kind of a mediation device in a sense. So it's holding things up. There's also the aspect of, if you look at losing control of your staff on the communal scale, it's like, I'm running a company and I just lost control of my staff. It's like, why are there so many snakes in this company? It's like, yeah, you've completely lost control. But then also the fact that just to the point about being able to seize the snake and then you have the staff, it also requires that, at least in the instance of Moses, that he has been given direct inspiration to have the relevance to realize, when you grab the snake, like, he's no Jeff Corwin, he's not just going to do this because that's his favorite thing. He's going and grabbing this thing knowing that it's going to be his staff. There's an element of faith there, but he literally just saw it happen. So, and he was given the command. So there's also the element of obedience there.
Yeah, I wanna set way more stage. You guys are walking ahead of me. So Um, I want to talk about putting our hand on something, right? So that means that we grasp it, right? We take control, as already mentioned, right? We're exerting dominion. Uh, it becomes an extension of us, right? So we start relating to the world through it, and it's a temporal engagement, right? So Mark was talking about putting it down, right? So the holding it up is something that we do with a purpose, right? And it costs us energy, right? Like it requires us to sustain it. The space that we create with the staff requires to be maintained, and and so our hands on the staff are not permanent fixtures, right? So uh, we kind of have to understand that, right? And so I'm I'm connecting this to the clothes that we were talking about previously, right? So our hands are like the clothes of the material. We're clothing the material in our spirit. And with our clothing, we can extend our will through the material to make it manifest our purpose. And and we can make it naked again, right? We can withdraw the clothing, right? And here we go to the eyes of God thing. It's like, okay, like that's what God does to us as well, right? Like when we're called, he wraps us in his hand, right? And we act out as his hand, right? So we're going to talk more about this symbolism of hands and holding staffs and all these things, right? But you can see the fractal nature, right? Where there's a covering of a spirit, right? And it doesn't have to be God's spirit, right? It can also be another person's spirit, like Castle was talking about with the staff, right? So the staff of a company is covered in the spirit of the company through the director of the company, um, if everything functions properly, at least, um, and they will carry out his will, right? And that's the proper order, right? And like he releases them when they're done with their work time, right? So like he's not taking a permanent hold or dominion over them, right? Because that would be called slavery, I guess, right? Where that freedom doesn't exist or doesn't exist in a manner that the servant is able to call upon it. So yeah, I'll let you guys respond.
So
Yeah, one of my thoughts about all this was that like seizing the snake, whatever, and it becoming a staff, that's very much like paying attention to something, which is, Pageau's the world is attention. You either pay attention to the thing and grab onto it, or you know, cast it down and you stop paying attention to it, and then it's the snake.
I had a couple of notes that I wanted to add to the connection between hand and will. So there's actually a lot that kind of overlaps there. So you have this aspect of the word hand actually comes from the suffix man, which is related to will. And so you can look at, I have 6 quick examples. So there's manipulate, manage, maneuver, command, manifest, and recommend. All of those are the same root between hand and like kind of expression of will. And then you have that bit about that you can nest the microcosms of a will or like the intentions of the hand at different scales. So I mean, in the human body, like you can intend in your mind for your hand to do a thing, and then the hand also cooperates with that. Like it doesn't have its own separate will. But then in the cases of different people, well, sometimes it might not cooperate with you depending on the conditions. I'm not claiming that it's consciously making that decision, but there can be a disconnect. But then you've got this aspect, like within the organization, that you can have, the boss wants something done a particular way, and that people can agree with that, or maybe they don't 100% agree, but they carry it out anyway. That there is this element of like uniformity of will, and that there is there is a sort of transgression that happens if there's a permanent hold or dominion, like Manuel was saying. And then I just want to point out the letting go aspect, that you don't have to grip it too tightly. Like you can just provide the form and allow it to do its thing, and like it's not going to go anywhere, versus completely letting go, which is also like if you get rid of someone at your organization, you said, sorry, we're going to have to let you go. And that doesn't mean like, oh, you can go like for the night and then we'll see you tomorrow or something like that. You know?
Yeah, I want to add on the idea of king's hand, right? So there's a relationship through with will and action, right? Or hands, right? And the will. So the will manifests through speaking, right? So when I speak to you, right, I can make you act out my will, right? But you're not my hand, right? So there's in the speaking there's an openness, I guess. While when I put my hand on you, I can exact force, right? And I can make you do, or at least bend to my will, like maybe not break you, but I can at least make you bend. And so when we're talking about laying your hands on something, right? That's a force doctrine. it's an earthly action. Is not an action of the spirit. And I think so when we're thinking about Moses' hand, right? And well, we can go to the first sentence in the Bible quotes, right? They will not believe me or listen to my voice, right? So what's there, right? Well, they're basically saying, well, how do I establish authority, right? Like, okay, God, like you told me this, right? Like I know it's true, but how do I speak your truth? And like I think what he's saying there is you can't speak my truth. You gotta manifest it. Like you gotta use your hands to show my presence in your action. And yeah, oh yeah, and I also wanted to say what you can take someone by the hand, right? So there's also a way where your action, right, like physically can be like a guidance of their will or something, right? Like, or like a training of their will. So to go back to the eyes of God, right? This perspective, right? So there's these interactions between the spiritual and the material, and there's proper ways to engage in these activities, right? Proper ways to extend hands, to shout commands, and there's improper ways, and within them you have a lot of wiggle, right? You have a lot of ways that you can establish, right? But if you are at least aware that you're in this space, right? To go back to Mark's comment at the start, right? If you are aware that these things are present, then you can call upon them, right? Like maybe not by intellectually mapping them all out, but just by trusting that they're there, right? By engaging with them in faith.
Yeah, I think you mentioned with respect to the hand, you mentioned the exertion of will, but what I was thinking was the effect of the hand, like physical touch. It can be very healing, like a hug. If you have touch starvation, all kinds of like humans are so social, right? That the most antisocial murders and stuff can still be punished with solitary confinement, right? Like, and I think a lot of those forces, when you're hugging, so probably there's tons of stuff that science has yet to discover. We know about things like mirror neurons when you watch a movie, and right, we could speak materially about certain aspects of this, but this type of when you have an impulse to hug someone, right? There's so much going on that like who cares, like. There's no point in thinking about it with the mind, and so like when you mentioned, knowing that a space exists and then being able to call upon it and sort of trusting that's kind of the imagery that comes to mind with respect to the other the other side of the coin, from will. There's divination. That's the snake as divination, or that's time.
I want to add actually to what both of you guys said. This bit of like the presence in the action, that it's not just that okay, this thing is happening or whatever. There's an intention behind it, or there are consequences as a result of it, despite the intention, which happens a lot. But I just want to give as points of contrast just a handful of little examples. So you've got lending a hand, so you can lend somebody a hand on a project. Or you can, a woman can give her hand in marriage. So there's very much an element of the will there. Or you can like say, oh, this person had a hand in an armed robbery or something like that. Like there's a lot of stuff in there just to flesh out the presence of the will in the actions there.
Or more like the signal of the will. Right?
Yeah.
Actions signal will. And they don't always do so perfectly, by the way, but they do. And that's the important part, is that's the advantage and disadvantage of co-manifestation, right? Is that it's not perfect because it turns out we're imperfect or something, and we're in an imperfect place, apparently. And so, yeah, our hand doesn't always obey, we'll say, right? Because maybe it can't. Like maybe we're reaching too high or too far, and our arm is only so long. And, like I'm never going to be a center on a basketball team, right? I'm 5'9". Like it's not going to happen, right? I can reach for that, but it's a waste of time, right? But also there is that signaling of what you're giving over to, right? Because your hand is very much the manifestation of your will. And so if you give it to something, right? So in this case, Moses gives his staff down to the earth. Basically, God takes over, snake appears, right? For the purpose, rather explicitly in the text, right? Thus they will believe that the God of their fathers has appeared to you. And that's super important, right? It's the power of co-manifestation. It's the power of giving up control and giving down the object in faith. And that's supposed to spread the faith effectively, right? That's basically what it's saying here, is that will spread the belief that the God of their fathers has appeared to you. It could, it's pretty clear actually. But it does take an action, and it takes more than one action by you to make that happen. Because throwing down the staff and making the snakes, at least in the movie, as I remember, that doesn't impress anybody, right? It's when he's able to recover it, and there's a technical reason for that, right? Because there is a snake that you can entrance basically and turn into a staff, but it doesn't turn back into a staff on your command, but Moses's does, and that's what makes it different. And so it is that two-way interaction. It's two actions, right? It's the fact that you can take something from a state, bring it to another state, and return it to the original state that is the magic, if you will. And that's what's super important.
Right, and so the states we're talking about is dominions, right? So he's casting it into the dominion of earth, and he's taking it back to the dominion of man. And one thing is really important there, I think, and he seizes it by the tail. So I don't think you pick snakes up by their tail. You pick them up by their head, right? Their head is where their control is, right? It's where their will is. It's what leads their being. And so if you pick a snake by the tail, right, which is the thing that follows the head, that means that you have like full relationship or something, right? Because you can control the head through the tail instead of controlling the head through the head. And I think I don't understand the symbolism there completely, but I think it's really important to know that when you control something by its consequences, right, or its manifestation, you have mastery, right?
Right.
Like
You have dominion.
everybody can grab a snake by its head and get lucky.
Right. But if you grab a real snake by its tail, you get bitten.
Yes,
That's what's going to happen to you. just to let you know, in case that wasn't clear.
so. I want to play a little bit about what it means to grab something, right? So the example I want to take is like, well, when we put our hands on something, especially in public, right, we create a space. So just imagine a gun on a table, right? Everybody's aware of the existence of the gun. Then when someone picks up the gun, everybody snaps to attention, right? Because like now someone has taken the power, right? You don't take power without purpose, right? So now it's like, what's the purpose, right? The gun now starts speaking, right? And it starts leading. It allows for leadership, right? It doesn't have to be direct leadership in the sense of you're listening to me because I have the gun, but you're attending to me because I got your attention, right? And I think that's the first establishment of space, right? You can see that with the relationship with the Pharaoh, right? So the Pharaoh doesn't bend his will, but he keeps meeting Moses, right? He definitely listens to the guy. So this idea of the staff, right? It conveys a certain authority to the person wielding whatever they pick up, right? Because now other people are listening. Um, and the way that they listen, you don't have control over, right? Because the Pharaoh hardens his heart. But that they're listening, no, you're wielding something, right? You have power, right? And we can go into politics and how we might misconstrue power, right? Or we're like wielding abstractions of abstractions of abstractions, right? And everybody's playing the same game, and thereby we still have power, but we kind of don't have to go by that. We can just go with the physical low resolution example, right? So what happens when someone picks up the gun? You create an arena, right? Because like now a certain game is set in motion, right? We don't know the rules of the game. We don't know the purpose of the game even necessarily, but we know that someone can get shot, right? Like we know that that's on the table, or literally no longer on the table because it's in someone's hands. um, so yeah, maybe someone wants to respond here. I guess I want to point out for Fakey's agent arena relationship idea, right? So I think it comes in here, and we have had many criticisms of that idea, because like I was talking about, right? Like the gun doesn't tell you what to do, like it just doesn't. When someone speaks and they have the gun, you might know what to do, right? Because now their will is made manifest. They get to dictate the rules of the game, or at least they become the point of reference for your actions.
Yeah, the agent arena relationship has so many problems. Like it's an individualistic perspective, right? There's one agent, there's one arena, but in the world that you will inhabit, there will never be an arena with one agent, right? That's not possible. And there's never an agent in only one arena. Like that's also not possible. And that's the main problem with it, is that's a good example of individualistic view, which is non-fractal, right? An individualistic view is removing yourself from all the other layers of the world effectively and isolating yourself, but you're never going to have existed in that, and that's why it's a very misleading frame. And that goes to the point at the bottom of this first page, right? Where you know, the hand of Moses becomes a miniature version of the heavenly will of God. Okay, so there's the practicality, right? There's the heavenly will of God. The manifestation is the hand of Moses, right? And that's what conveys the belief, right? And again, the belief is not conveyed by turning the staff into a snake, because there's other ways to do that. The belief is conveyed by bringing it back to a staff.
I wanted to add, I think there's just this bit about the signals and being able to actually, grasp the thing that is providing the signal, like with the gun example and stuff. And of course, if I'm being difficult, like there's also context dependence sometimes. Like I've been in rooms where I was in a room with a bunch of people that all had guns and I did not, except that those were my coworkers and they were cops, those sorts of things. Or, I've been in situations where there's a bunch of people and every single person has an armed, is carrying a loaded weapon or something like that, but it was an indoor-outdoor range, something like that. But I also wanted to I have a silly little story about the this bit of, so you have the aspect of Moses, he casts the snake or the staff on the ground, it turns into a snake, and then Moses also runs away. So like you also have this like immediate little exile type of thing that happens. And it reminds me, I had this silly incident at like as a kid, I was at the summer camp for nerds, and they had I was trying to point to someone in a particular direction. They were asking me where they should go, which building had something. And so I extended my hand, and I didn't actually point with my fingers. My fingers were kind of just there, but I just used my arm without actually articulating my fingers. And what I didn't know is that there was a girl that was in my creative writing class that was pretty much at arm's length. And so what she experienced was my middle finger coming right towards her eye. And all she just saw was just my middle finger extending towards her face, and she didn't know why. And that immediately resulted in an appeal to authority and exile on both of our parts. And, temporarily, just for like a couple of minutes. And there was an immediate sort of, miscommunication there. But then also, I just want to add about habituation to the signal. So you've got Moses has the staff, and clearly, like, there's some connection. Like, even if Pharaoh doesn't know what it is, he knows that there's some connection between the fact that this guy has a staff and that all of these plagues keep happening in his land, and he's listening to him. Like, he's got the weapon, but he's also becoming more habituated to it every single time. So there is this little bit of like, even if it gets worse, and he's hardening his heart and he's a proud guy and everything. But there is that bit where he seems to be only more convinced when his own son dies. And even at that, it's like it wears off pretty quick.
So, I want to refocus our awareness, which is interesting. I'm not thinking of the talking stick that they have in the sewing circle, hippie dippies, but that's kind of what it is, right? Like when I speak, like I also hold something up, right, to call your attention in some spiritual manner, and so Moses is confronted with sharing his awareness of God, right, and so he gets this godly staff, right. So instead of having a gun which can fire bullets, he's having a talking stick from God. There we go. Just fix that one. It, like, the staff becomes the vehicle of all the eyes, right? All the eyes are on the staff, and when the staff moves or the holder of the staff moves, everybody moves with it. At least their eyes move with it, and so it's important to realize that if this is the case, right, there's something speaking through the staff, right? Something speaking through the staff beyond Moses, right? And something is manifest, right? Like, because there's a communion, right? At least in presencing that occurs, and so this, I don't know, like you can envision the dynamics, right? How there's some heavenly will coming through, and then because all eyes are on there, a new dynamic manifests, right? So because everybody is adhering to the heavens speaking, well, a miracle occurs, literally, right? And so then how does that happen? Well, that happens through the mediation of Moses holding up the staff, right? And his hand touching the staff, right? And then I want to point at the staff, right? Like it will later become an ark, right? And that ark will later become a temple, and that will later become the human heart, right? In the sense that now it's just a direct reference to heaven, that no longer requires the material version because Jesus has taken that place, right? And I think there's something in what all our eyes are drawn to, and how it can reshape our existence, right? So a different example of this would be Moses putting the snake on the stick, right? Which is basically the same thing, right? But now he's putting the stick down at the center of the camp, right? So now it's a permanent fixture. So he's and that's also true for the temple, right? Like it's being put into a material or a carrier that's exceeding the necessity of the hand of man keeping it up, right? Because the collective is worshiping it instead. Yeah, I'll let it go there.
Thought we were joking about not getting through this chapter, but I can see that we're actually in danger of such a thing. I did want to point out that the very last full sentence here on this page is, as such, it can either seize material reality to form dry land or let it loose to create flooded land. And so that's another statement of the fractal power, fractal nature of the staff and the hand's ability to manifest within, we'll say, the arena of the earth, or the arena of the material world, if you want to use agent arena relationship. So once the agent has been given, we'll say, a direct instruction from the emanation of all creation, I think is the best way to say that, it now has the power to affect creation at multiple different levels based on need and will. And that's actually, the super significant part of this. And at this point, I'll be thrilled and happy if we can get to the next page.
Before we do, I do have one thing to add about the dry land bit. So I wanted to make really quick the connection with just because I couldn't let go of the talking stick from God aspect. I was thinking of the cherubim with the flaming sword. So you've got he's out there, he's got the talking stick, right? It's clearly giving off a very obvious signal to people who have never seen a weapon before. And so you've got the staff member standing outside the building at this point, holding the flaming stick. And you also have the aspect of all of the opportunities within the bounds of that realm that the staff member is standing outside of have dried up. So there is the garden as such in being walled has now been grasped or confiscated in a sense. And so that opportunity, at least at the present time, has been dried up and taken away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I had a couple criticisms at the end of the page. So the hand of Moses becomes a miniature version of the heavenly will. It's an expression of the heavenly will, not the heavenly will itself. And then when we're talking about flooded land and dry land, so lands are things upon which things get established. So at least the way I'm envisioning the interaction with the Pharaoh is not land, right? Like we're establishing authority here, and I think it would be good to speak about these spiritual concepts not in the establishment of land, right? Because I think the land is connected to building, and Moses isn't building anything, right? He just wants to take his people out, right? So he wants to break the bondage. He wants to become the head, just like with the snake, right? He's trying to grab the Pharaoh still, and he is doing that, right? Because he's not directly challenging the Pharaoh. Like he's letting God challenge the Pharaoh maybe for him, but he's not doing it himself, right? He's not overstepping his position. He keeps petitioning, like, can you let us go, right? It's not like we're gonna go, right? Because he could do that, right? But he's not, at least not until the end. And I don't even know if he does it in the end. That's my lack of biblical knowledge there.
Hey, one last thing, just real quick. The bit where he says, God asked Moses, "What's that in your hand?" I just want to point out, I always find it really just kind of entertaining to me, but also important that a lot of times God will answer someone with a question. So there's this sort of, it's a call to attention and then immediately a call to participation as well. Like, clearly, as we're going to see here on this next page, which I will let us get to, God is able to use like his own tools and everything, but he like wants that participation and calls people to actually, look at the stuff that he wants them to do. That's all I got.
Yeah, and I want to follow up on that. Is like, I think God saying that changes what is in his hands.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's no longer the same thing because God called attention to it.
Yeah.
It's now a divine thing, a divine tool, I guess. Okay. So.
Yeah, I want to piggyback real quick, Manuel, on your comment on authority. This whole section is about how you establish authority. And Moses' primary objection is, I can't walk in there and say, hey, man, God told me, like, you all suck and we need to go. Right, which, okay, right. But the implication is there's no set of words or statements, or maybe we could call them propositions, right, that can establish his authority. The only thing that can establish his authority is an action, but it's not just any action, because his priests can do a similar action, but it's not the same action and it's not as powerful. And that action is manifest, and hopefully this answers and theory goes question. His action is not manifest in immateriality or the ethereal or spiritual realm. That would be words. That's his initial objection, right? I can't just speak magical words into the world. And this is when people talk about, the spell won't work. Spells classically, pretty much in all the quote mythoses, because if you're talking about spells, you're talking about mythos. Everywhere in literature involve action. Sorry, like there's no magical spells that are words only. That actually, I mean, I'm sure there's exceptions somewhere. They're all wrong, by the way. I'm well studied on this, far better studied on this than the Bible, unfortunately. That doesn't exist. And this is the statement of that. Like, no, I've got to show them through my actions that I'm your representative. Right. And so that is the materiality, right? Because it's easy for us to deny the ethereal or spiritual experience because it's so unique to us, irrespective of what we have in common, right? You can sit there and you say, oh, all three young girls saw Mary at Fatima, sort of a thing, right? You can do things like that, but sure, I get that, right? And then people can be skeptical, of course they can, right? But when it's a staff turning into a snake and turning back into a staff, because that's a material manifestation, it's very hard to ignore, right? Because the material is something that we have, we'll say, a more consistent, reliable, coherent experience with between each other than not. Now, again, that's not perfect, right? Because if you're further away, did it really turn into a snake? I don't know. It's a little fuzzy way over there, right? But also the independent validation exists, right? And this is what science in particular relies on, is this idea of independent validation, where other people can follow a procedure and validate that your experience was exactly what you reported. That's the whole trick of science. Science can't do anything else. Anybody using a definition of science that doesn't include that, you'll notice I include replication deliberately, right? Like the first instance is not science. It's just fantasy that was written down in a book or in a white paper or something. But when you do it too, or somebody else does it too and says, no, I can validate that this procedure is correct and accurate, then it's science. If you use any other definition for science, everything fails and you destroy the world, for real. And that's part of the scientism and the problems that we're experiencing today. So I did want to link all this not only to authority, and separate the material from the ethereal in a useful way. It looks like I did my job. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. A lot of times people don't get it. So I'm glad I was clear enough. And also link it to something we're seeing today in the world, which is this scientism and this over-reliance on science. I used to be a big science fan, and now I basically want to shoot anybody who claims to be a scientist. So these things happen, I guess. The world changes. So yeah, I wanted to make that clear, because this really does demonstrate the difference between the ethereal or spiritual realm and the material realm, and why it matters and in what way it matters, right? Because the pharaohs, people can also make staffs turn into snakes. This isn't interesting, right? But because it doesn't come down from the creator, it's not the same thing, even though the material manifestation is pretty darn close.
And it does come down, right? And so I want to add on a bunch of things, right? So the reason that the priests can do this is because they serve gods, right? And what happens with the 10 miracles that will happen is that these gods get dethroned by the one God that Moses serves, right? And in that dethroning, and I'm going to write an article about this because, I have a Substack. You can find it, Agapic Orientation, at Agapic Orientation on Substack. So what's happening in these miracles is, first of all, Moses does the first. No, not Moses. Aaron does the first three, right? So if we're talking about independent manifestations, right? There's something there where it's not only Moses speaking. Moses gets this mediator for him, right? And he's as God to Aaron as God is to him, right? So now we're getting the fractal nature. Then Moses' miracles, right, that manifest through the hands of, no, not Moses, Aaron, sorry. The miracles that manifest through the hands of Aaron are manifest upon the gods of the land, the Egyptian gods of the land, right? While Moses is dealing with the gods of the people. And so you can see again, right, there's dominions established, there's relationships established, there's a back and forth, right? There's like the recognition, this idea that the priests can also do things, and at a certain point the priests also step out of the story. They're like, no, we can't do this anymore, right? And the pharaoh just keeps on going because, like, the pharaoh is like, no, I can stand this for a while, right? Like you're not going to dethrone me, right? So there's the levels of authority, right, that go in play. And so what ends up happening is there's this whole spiel where there's a challenge, right? There's a response, there's an implication, there's a new challenge, new response, implication, sets of 3, by the way, right? Which is like the fulfillment of the cycle, right? Then the cycle transfers to a different domain. You get the same dynamic. And the reason why this is important, right, is if we're talking about the establishment of authority, right, we kind of have to go through the fractal layers, right? Just like there's 6 days of creation, right, where we're going through all of the layers so that the fullness of the creation, well, it's not even full because we still have the rest of Genesis, but at least the partial fullness of creation can be established. We also need to do that with authority, right? Like we, in order for us to recognize that something is really true, we have to have it manifest in different manners, right, through different means, so that we can test whether it's real or not, right? Like Peterson talks about this, right? When there's cross-domain recognition of a pattern being there, it's like extra true, right? Because there's independent verification of a pattern. And I'll give my stick up once a take. I offer it to God. There.
I like the independent verification bit because it just kind of reminds me. I mean, I'm thinking of, and of course this is way after Exodus and all these things, but thinking of the thing with like Jesus healing the leper, and he still sends him to the temple priest to get independently verified and brought back into the community. And it's just like, yeah, you can still totally do all of that work, but also like there is the benefit there to having like, here's a material guy that everybody knows that is clearly like the guy at the temple, and you can go and that guy will vouch for the fact that you're clean now. And even though like that isn't strictly necessary, and yet it's something that people actually pay attention to. But I wanted to mention just the top lines of this because it's a pretty big claim that he makes, that he says the miracle of picking up and letting go of the snake is a complete symbol of God specifically as creator of both space and time, and that it acts as a sign of later God's hand casting Israel down into exile and then leading them back into their homeland. So I just didn't want to cast that down without picking it up.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We'll get into the leading thing. But I think I want to connect that to the nature of the staff, right? So, like the staff is used to challenge, right? But it's also used to lead, right? Like it has different roles, right? So there's different qualities of the mediation, right? It also is used for the splitting of the sea that we'll get into. But then you can see that what the staff can do changes in the way that everybody's attending to it, right? And the circumstances in which it is applied and all of these things. Yeah, so who wants to take it off on the second page so I don't set the frame the whole time?
I guess if I could just add one thing about the walking stick as kind of like a third pillar for additional stability, that there is the advantage there of you have stability if you got the two pillars that you can, I mean, in this case, legs, but also if you're dealing with an arch or something like that. But there is an added bit of stability that you have there. So I just wanted to point that out where he says, rectifying or dressing the body against destructive influences of time. And so there is, we're seeing a lot more of the thing about, technology and this need for sort of artificial stability. But then also some of these implications of what if you receive that like as an emanation, as opposed to just picking up a random stick.
Yeah, and I like this because what you're saying, because I've been talking about something that's shared, right, among people, right? So yeah, but the stick also has functionality for the person, right? And so what does that do? Well, that's like mediating the fractal nature, right? So there's a meaning that's individual to Moses or personal. Sorry, Mark. It's personal to Moses, but there's also a meaning that is to the group, right? And that's also true for Moses, which is interesting, right? But it's also distinct for Moses because he's the head, which is also like I made this tweet, right? Like things don't look the same from the inside as from the outside. So it's different for the Egyptians than for the Israelites, right? Which is really interesting that because at one point the plague stopped manifesting for all of them, and I think this is the point where it goes to Moses instead of it stays in the hands of Aaron, right? So, and well, I can jump a little bit ahead, right? The splitting of the sea is also a miracle that's unique to the Israelites, because it doesn't manifest for the Egyptians that are chasing them, right? And they get swallowed by the sea. And that has also really interesting implications of what the promised land is, right? So it also means that the promised land is separated and unattainable for the Egyptians. And well, I'm just adding too many things together, right? So I want to go to the first pictogram, and the seizing of the snake, right, is establishment of space, right? But it's also a different space, right? Like you can also see it as something is there, right? That is holding attention or whatever, and now something else is holding attention, right? So it's also the movement, right? So you can see the time aspect, right? So it's the adherence from one principle moving to the adherence to a different principle, right? Or authority. Maybe authority is the right word here. And then the releasing of the staff, right, allows for a new authority to manifest. That's basically. And also this idea of dressing, like I was thinking that the land can also dress people, right? So that which is below, like for example, when a snake occurs from the grass, right? Now the ground is dictating action, right? It's possessing what is manifesting, right? So there's also an element where you can be clothed in things that come from below, and then grabbing it, right, is you reestablishing your will, right, and thereby establishing authority and dominion. Yeah, and remembering this artificiality part, right? So what does artificial means, right? Like it's like it kind of goes against nature or entropy or whatever, right? So it is costly, right? We have to remember that it's costly and it requires sacrifice, right? Someone has to do it. Like they have like Atlas, right, holding up the world. Like someone's gonna have to do that, because if no one's doing it, it won't happen. Oh yeah. So I was also thinking about the footnote where it's talking about positions of the hand. All right. Pointing, making a fist, right? Like a fist holds something. A finger, pointing a finger directs something, right? A palm contains things, right? Like you can put things on them, right? So the gestures of the hand, they translate into ways in which I can carry things in the world, right? Or manifest things in the world.
So I was thinking about, hands being seeds, and in lots of propaganda posters, whether it's the "I want you, Uncle Sam" or the communist fist to the sky, the hand is enlarged in a lot of the images. They want to emphasize the image of power. And then I got thinking about, like in all these images, one of the things like the Roman salute, or the the Oath of Horatio painting, like the North Korean, or the what's going on physically with different types of salutes. I was thinking about what it says here about the Moses' staff is the ability to split the waters and create dry land, either mediating in one direction versus the other. And I see common patterns physically in these different types of salutes, like, U.S. hand on the heart versus military salute to the head takes more energy. It's more of a fiery thing, right? The old hand to the sky takes more energy. There's something more active about the physical posture of saluting in that type of a manner. So like symbolically, when we have art where we have like, a fist clenched to the sky, like in maybe the communist or the Black Lives Matter type of images, there's an element of, there's something oppositional about it, right? Yeah. Where that mediation, are we splitting waters and creating dry land, or are we integrating? Like in the Chinese kung fu, like when you bow at the end of a class, it's, your thumbs form a yin yang symbol, and this symbolizes water crashing over a rock. But physically, this is very natural. It's very integrated. There's a physical difference between, saluting in our culture. We shake hands to indicate disarmament versus, hand on the heart to pledge allegiance, right? I don't know exactly what I'm saying. I guess I'm just rambling about aesthetic patterns, but there are definitely patterns, right, of when you're of higher energy states anyway, I'll just leave it at that for now. But I was thinking about this element of rebellion. Like, why is it that it's so obvious? Like, why is it that certain images, like in propaganda, or we look at certain images, whether it's art or a salute, and you just know what it means. I don't know why, but we know. Well, this is rebellious.
It's easy, Danny. It's actually really easy. Like, the hand is not a symbol of power. Like, the hand is a symbol of potential action, right? And as we talked about earlier, right, it's the hand that gives down, and that creates the space for the higher thing to enter and turn into the snake. But then the hand seizes that control again, right? And in doing so, it closes off the potential of the snake back into a staff. Now, the fact that one hand can do all of that is the signal that it is that hand is being, we'll say, guided divinely, right down from the Creator. A closed fist cannot do the positive action ever. Now, sometimes negative action is required. You have to destroy to create, blah blah blah, whatever, right? Sometimes that's, but most of the time, that's not correct, right? So when you raise a fist, you are in opposition. That's what you're stating. You have closed off the potential and the possibility of the world. Now, there's different ways to mediate that, as you pointed out, which is excellent call out, by the way, by the bow, right? By the bow that you would use in some sort of martial arts practice, right? That those bows tend to show respect for the actions that were performed, right? Or the actions that are going to be performed. Usually both, right? Usually bow at the beginning and the end of the tournament or the battle. And when you don't do that, it's a sign of disrespect. Why? It's not a sign of disrespect to the other person. It's a sign of disrespect to the idea of the ability of the person to manifest action in the world. It's an insult to a concept not just to the person, right? You're disrespecting that. And the thing with that is that all of that level of signaling, if we can sort of put it that way, I think I'll get my meaning across, even though the language is a little sloppy and difficult. That level of symbolism is all intuitive. And so I can call it out here and say, well, yeah, because the fist is closed. It's like, it's true, but not true enough. There's other symbols that indicate a closing off or an identification against, and that's Manuel's favorite thing is identification against. Right. As opposed to an openness, right? Like if I do this, it's inviting. And if I do this, it's pretty clear it's not inviting. It's the opposite of inviting, right? It's an opposition. Opposition, to oppose means to set against. In other words, you've already taken an action and reframed the world. That's why opponent processing is an act of will, and cooperative processing is basically not an act of will in the same way, right? Because opponent, that means you're actively working against something that's already in action, right? Whereas cooperative processing is you're trying to find a way to fit in, right? Or to go along with something. And that's actually a really important aspect. But we know that through intuition. We do not know that through proposition. So even though I can sort of express, we'll say, the zeitgeist of it or the spirit of it in words, and that works maybe well enough for some people, we know it through intuition. And we've very much thrown out intuition in our world, and that's why we're confused. Like, why is communism bad? I don't know, the hammer and the sickle. These are not positive tools in the world. Right? It's not that they can never be used towards the good, but then that's true of everything. So what are you saying? At that point, you've just stated a universal, kind of worthless. You didn't really say anything because it's universally true, right? And we get confused because we're not looking, or we're not paying attention to, we're not attending to our intuition. And our intuition also isn't perfect, much like all our other senses, by the way. So again, when you say intuition isn't perfect, not really saying anything, no kidding. Thanks, Captain Obvious. But that's the important part, is that we realize that the meaning of actions, motions, salutes is not, because meaning is never contained in one thing, is not contained in the expression, right? It's contained in the context plus the content, which would be the expression. And you need both.
I got some notes. Oh, go
ahead. So putting up your hands, right, showing that they're empty. Big important gesture, right? Also, you're lifting them up above your head, which takes effort. Also, you're putting them in a high place, right, which is visible to everybody. Also, it's related to worship, right? So that's important. Putting down your weapons, right? Putting them on the ground, removing them from your hands, no longer having dominion over them, right? Like also pretty universal sign of surrender. So there's things, right? Like, okay, if you have a weapon in your hand, you can do things, right? Like agency is available to you. When you put them down, you at least have to pick them up, right? But you signal that you're willing to give up the agency, right? That's the signal that you're bringing, right? And you don't have to understand the symbolic nature of this, right? Because the implications are clear, right? Like if someone doesn't hold the weapon, that's just better than if they're holding the weapon. So like that's inherently a good thing, right? Unless they're on your side. Yeah, so there's just a bunch of things, right? Like putting down your pen. also things like, okay, there's a way in which I'm influencing the world that I'm also willing to give up, right? So there's different ways in which the hands express their agency, right? And we haven't gotten into washing of the hands, right? So like, what is washing? Well, like, you're washing away things that interfere with your mediation, right?
Right.
So there's all sorts of things, right, where the way that we grasp the world, right, the potential in the world, is mediated through our hands, right? And that can be direct, right? When we have clean hands, right? Or it can be mediated if we have dirty hands, right? And sometimes that mediation is actually wanted, like when we wear gloves. We want mediation because we don't want to be exposed to certain things directly, right? Um,
Well, I
yeah, I
want to
think
point out one sort of larger issue about the book club in general before Castle gets out whatever it is he's definitely importantly needs to say.
he's pregnant.
The fact that we have to have this book and talk about it is a big L for society. This should not be necessary at all. This is not a good thing. I mean, I'm glad we're doing this. I'm very grateful that Manuel runs this book club and that we get to go through it and that I get to read it again and all that and share, whatever insights I seem to have with everybody. But the fact that we have to do this is a very bad sign for the world and society. Now, I will mediate that somewhat by saying, I for one did not get a huge amount out of the book in the way that some other people seem to, just because a lot of it to me is kind of like, well, duh. And if you're sort of familiar with symbology in general, you can just go through the pictures and you don't really need the words, and that's a good sign. A lot of Catholics I talk to, yeah, they're just like, oh yeah, those pictures were great, right? Whatever, the words are the words, like who cares, right? But the information that's in the book is primarily contained within the pictures, and it should be obvious to somebody who is already sort of well instantiated in what we call a poetic way of informing the world. You can see my model video on navigating patterns for more on that, or my live stream, because I have a live stream on the same topic. But it's not really a good sign that we have to go through this book as a society. But I think it's a small number of people, relatively speaking, right? I don't think it's 80% of the population doesn't have intuitive understanding of these things, or 80% of the population doesn't understand symbolic images. Like, I don't think it's that high. It's probably a lot lower, but it should be closer to zero than it is, which is why we're here. But I'm glad we're here. So with that, I'll let Castle get out whatever brilliance he needs to share with us, because it'll be important, I'm sure.
Thank you. I have the talking stick. So a few things. I got a whole bunch of notes on this. So with and Danny, you had a whole bunch of really good points, because I really liked the bit about the amount of energy and kind of the elevation of the different types of salutes and things like that. This is going to get important for the following pages when we get to them next week. But I was looking at this, and you had the aspect. I was kind of very briefly this week. I was talking to Manuel, and there's this aspect of he's raising the staff and he's moving his hand at the same time. So to the point that, yeah, you can kind of you can move your fingers, but he has to extend his hand. So in an embodied sense, I'm imagining kind of the motion of moving a curtain out of the way or something like that. Because, and as we'll see on the next page, which I'm not ready to go to yet, that when he does this, God blows a wind on the waters. And so you have this kind of dryness that's happening. It's a very kind of airy type of motion that's taking place there. And I like the point about you have the walking stick, so it's supposed to be planted in the ground, at least for the movement. And you have the bit about there's this larger pillar of mist during the day and fire at night that is going along with the Israelites, and it moves and that indicates for them to move. So it's like the head determines that, okay, the staff or this giant walking stick is going to start moving. Now the feet have to get moving as they go. But there is an aspect of separation that's going on once you do that. And this will actually, there's a bit that'll come up later about halting time, which is really interesting, and it's related to the same sort of motion. That when you have something that is supposed to be grounded that is separated, that there are consequences. So you look at something like, I think it's Salvador Dali did a painting of, it's like a crucifix floating in the air or something. And like, this is actually technically a heretical image because it's supposed to be a grounded, like you have the pillar aspect of between holding up heaven and earth. That's supposed to be happening. When you completely disconnect that and remove the grounding, there are negative consequences. And negative consequences that are maybe not as immediate as getting your chariot wrecked in the middle of a bunch of waves, but maybe to the same degree of extreme.
Like all your art is terrible and sucks and
right.
should be burned. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And maybe it still influences the world despite that, you know. And then so you've also got this bit about embracing the stability. So you have Moses is raising the staff, but he's also attending to something higher. So he's got his arm holding on to something high up. And I'm just kind of imagining, like, you know, if you're on like a boat that's rocking or something like that, and maybe, you know, it's a silly image, but like you know, you've been boarded by pirates and you got to fight them, but also the boat is getting rocked like crazy. And it's like, well, you grab onto the stability, and then you're also using your other arm to ward off the chaos that's happening there. And to the point about the disrespect of not being able to get the embracing happening with a gesture, you think of those things where somebody goes in for a handshake and then someone else pulls it away and goes too slow, you know, and you've got, that is a complete insult against the gesture itself and the other person,
right,
to the previous point. And then also, not only is there the, just for a reverse context of, or contrast rather, of the putting down your weapons, but if you raise your weapon as part of as a war cry or something, that means now you're going to advance, and that is going to become more important next week when we get to the next page. All right, that's all I got.
I got way more because I just got an amazing insight. So, what does like a ton of people walking to a place look like? Like a snake. All right, thank you. What happens if you have an organized group walking somewhere, you stand still and you raise your hand? They stand in formation. They become like a stick, right? So, interesting how that dynamic manifests on groups of people. Now, this idea of lifting up the staff, right, and stretching out the hand. Okay, so stretching out the hand is moving away also, right? It's pushing creates wind, right? That wind gets taken over or whatever, right, by the wind of God, right, which is blowing over the waters, which is making me think of Genesis 1 or something, or 2. The Spirit of God is floating over the waters, right? So what does the Spirit of God floating over the waters do? Well, it initiates the whole of creation, right? Like the whole Genesis 1 thing is initiated by that Spirit, right? And so the creation of land, right, which is part of that on day 3, again, through the consequence of light, we can maybe see the light back into the pillar of God. Like, I don't know how that fits in, but it's probably important. And so what is it also doing, right? Well, now we're relating to a promise, right? And the promise is somewhere in the water or beyond the water, all right? And so in the faithfully adhering to the promise and doing all the gestures or whatever, right? Like the right pattern, participating in the right pattern, you get access to that which is beyond the water, right? Which is promised to the people, right? They go worship in the desert. And when they go in there, right, God is holding back the Egyptians, right? So now these two groups, they're not the same, right? And they're not the same by God's will, as a consequence of God's will, right? Because like here, I think is the eye of God is really important in this piece, right? Because like in the judgment of God, you are not partaking in the promised land, right? And then how is he holding them back, right? He's holding them back by like a wall of water, right? Like a cloud. and and so there is waters between Israel and Egypt, right? And then they're trying to cross the water, right? When that wall is removed, right? And they end up entering the deep waters, right? Which is on a different fractal layer, I guess, or different level, and that collapses on them, right? And they drown, right? So that means that they're blocked from entering the promised land. And I thought this whole scenery was really interesting. I kind of diverted. Okay. Okay, so oh yeah, so there's two connections of heaven and earth, right? Like one is the pillar of fire that's behind the Israelites, holding up a space that's shared between the Israelites and the Egyptians, right? And also separated with the cloud at the same time, right? And at the front, Moses, as an agent of God, is lifting up his staff, right? Making a new connection, right? So there's to going back to Genesis 1, right? It's the separation of the waters from the waters, right? So now there's two spaces created, one for the Egyptians, right? And one for the Israelites, right? And the Israelites get a different space, right? And so I think the space that they're getting is like they're being like the heavens, the second heavens on earth, right? So the people chosen by God, right? So they get to be the stars on earth. And then, yeah, so the extension of the blessing of Moses is like a human or an artificial space that is created by his staff, right? And the one that is created behind them is more natural, right? Is more basic. Let's just say it in that manner. And yeah, in other words, the mediation of Moses is special and constrained to Israel. Did anyone want to respond to that?
I just wanted to add another parallel, just the thing with the walled garden, that you have this kind of reinstantiation of a flaming pillar that is stationed as or in conjunction with a wall that is kind of denoting a barrier to entry, and which is just completely uncrossable just by signal. Like the Egyptians don't even try. Like they're actually not that far, and they don't even try, and it's a pillar, right? But they don't bother trying to go around it or anything like that.
Yeah, and so yeah, so then we get to the conclusion, right? And so it's interesting. So the Egyptians try to follow them when the wall gets lifted, right? And then they get caught in a different wall, right? Like the wall of water, actual water, and it's interesting. I don't know where the word is, but the look of a disorganized army of the Pharaoh in battle, right? That was the wording that was used. Oh yeah, and this I'm picking this from the first part. It's like God looked at the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and the cloud, and this comforted them. So I had to look up that word, right? And it's like a military term where you put them in disarray, effectively, right? You break their ability to have coherence, right? So in other words, like that would be like on a human level, that would be like dazed or something, right? Um, and then the other thing is he took off the wheels of the chariots and made them drive heavily, right? So their means of propagation, right? Their means of being speedy and having agency all over the battlefield as a group, right? Because that's what chariots allow them to do, right? Is taken from them, right? And so uh, they lose grasp, right? They lose the ability to be effective agents for the pharaoh, right? Because that's what the army is, right? Like the army is the hand of the pharaoh, right? Or at least a, a, a fist of the pharaoh. And the fist of the pharaoh is proven ineffective. That's what's described there. And then Moses stretches out his hands, right? So now it's interesting that God is not doing this for Moses, right? God is letting Moses drive this, right? He's saying, no, you through your hands, you need to put them in the flood. And so this flood, I see referencing back to Noah and the covenant, right? So in some sense, I see the pillar that was moving, like the natural pillar, right, as the covenant of Noah, right, and because Egypt has removed itself from being bound to Egypt, right, they're no longer protected by that covenant, right, and so they fall back into the flood.
I was looking at this bit about it says that in the morning watch, so I guess that would be somewhere around like 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., something like that. That was around the time that they start their charge. So it's like right before daybreak, and God is looking at them through the pillar of fire, and then it's at that point that they get thrown into panic. So they're surrounded by darkness, I guess, at this point, and then it's right at like the turning point of when it's going to turn into day. But and then you have, now I was looking, I haven't looked at enough translations, but it's interesting. You have this bit that he says he took off the wheels of their chariots and made them drive heavily. I've seen another one that seemed like that the wheels were clogged or something, like caused them to break, like brake, something like that. I mean, it's functionally kind of a similar thing, but there's this bit of like extreme straightness being imposed upon the turning. And so I just found that was kind of an interesting thing. And I also wanted to just comment on the bit about the framing through which God is looking at. So you mentioned he's looking at them through the wall of fire, which is not a good framing to be. But if it just kind of calls to mind like these different types of things of, you have I think it's like King David goes, and in some of his Psalms, he asks God to look upon him in a particular way, whether it's pity because he's surrounded by his enemies, or mercy because of his sins, or these sorts of things. And then you have in the tradition from the last couple millennia of this thing of, people praying that God will see, will see his people through the wounds of his son's hands, essentially. And so I thought that sort of bit of like grabbing attention and also like constraining the frame to like a much more precise sort of frame, not seeing the entire picture, and that being an aspect of mercy as well. It's just, I see that bit of, you have the darkening or dimming so that you don't see the entire light of the situation, which is maybe not very good, versus seeing the entire light, or like looking straight through an entire wall of fire, and like 100% of the stuff is available to you at that point. I thought that sort of contrast was interesting.
Oh yeah, that's interesting, right? Because what I was thinking is like the pillar is also establishing the space under it, right? So if you're looking through the pillar, right, you're judging through the authority of that space, and so yeah, like if you enter into a space, right, and you're not qualified to participate in that space, right, like the eye that's looking through the pillar of that space is gonna judge you not worthy, right, like and exile you, right, like literally, like you're gonna be exiled, and that the exile is done, right, not only through the flood, right, like because you were talking about the darkness thing, right, so that's just a reversal of creation, right, like that's just the taking away of the light, that is allowing you to be with God, right, or in the blessing of God, because Matthieu is talking about how things are returning to their natural state or something, right, of the flood. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. Like the way of looking at it is, what are you blessed in the eyes of God, right? And God is taking away your blessing as a consequence of your unworthiness, right? And that might be, from your perspective, look like the flood, right? But actually what's happening is you fall from grace. And that's where you're screwed.
Yeah, that reminds me. I've thought on this a little bit recently. I remember there was something so impersonal about and it was an interaction between people that all get along very well, but it was a work interaction, and this one guy went and called and spoke to my coworker, and she said, "Sorry, I can't connect you to the other guy that you're looking for. We'll try to work it out later." And then he sent an email saying that he called and that it didn't work. Not, oh, I was told that we're not going to be able to do this or whatever, but that the procedure of calling and getting what I want, it didn't work. Not some sort of relationship type of thing, and there were constraints on the situation or anything like that. And so there is that bit of like, not maybe if there was a particular kind of favor that he had gotten, maybe something could have been worked out, or maybe an exception could have been made or something like that. But if you're relying on how it works, then you're probably going to have undesirable results.
Well, that connects to a different tweet I made today, over this week. We produce instead of honor, right? So if you go into that call with wanting to produce a meeting or whatever, right, instead of honoring the process and honoring the person that you're participating with, yeah, like obviously you're not going to receive the grace, like yeah. The only way that they can participate with you is by being duty bound, right? It's like, I'm going to do this against my will because you're an asshole. It's like
yeah, that's also, I think there's an interesting thing there where you've got, I think it was like Abraham went and sent his servant to go and get a wife for his son. And that like God had literally promised that was going to happen, and he still told the servant, like, hey, don't cash in on the promise. Like, still just ask for mercy, and then you go do the job. But like, just the entire time, don't actually cash in, even though he promised it. And it's like that's a good proper relationship, I think, rather than trying to make things into some sort of transaction.
Mm-hmm. And I think that also calls back to Eve, right? Not following Adam's instruction of conveying the will of God. I was like, no, you really gotta do this manner, because else you're gonna mess it up, and you're gonna bring back a snake, right? Yeah. So Yeah, I thought it might have been interesting to take a moment to stand at this idea of the promised land, right? So it's 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 literally separated by a sea, right? Like there's a qualitative difference that cannot be bridged, and so there's to look from the establishment perspective, right? So what happens after this? Well, the wandering happens, right? So there's this new space, right? There's new lands, and like what do we do? like what are the rules of these lands, right? And later on we're climbing mountains, right? And we're getting tablets that are really heavy because we have to throw them to the ground. Um, which is interesting, right? Holding up stones, right? Um, and holding up a staff are also different things, right? Um, um, so yeah, so we're coming to a place. Let me see. I need to scroll. Um, like this graph is interesting, and it's kind of talking about the promised land, right? So uh, he has three aspects that he's pointing out here, right? So we've now established the space, right? Like we've separated ourselves from Egypt. We're in the promised land, or at least we're bound to it, like in destination. Um, and then it's like, okay, so we're supposed to seize the land, right? We're supposed to assume it, right? Like assume dominion over it. So there's a leading there, right? And the leading has to do with awareness or coming to know, right? You are led into the knowledge of what you're participating in, and then at a certain point you need to use that knowledge or whatever awareness of your surrounding to build something, right? To build something lasting, right? So uh, what you're doing is you're establishing space within the space, which is like building a house, right? It's like a residency is a space in a space, right? And then to build upon the residency, you build government, right? Because that's like the space of the residencies, all right? Or in the Greek, that would be the polis. And in Latin, I think that would be the civis, right? So there you have politics and civilization coming from there. Um, and in some sense, right, like that group gathering, right, which is different than leading, uh, because now you have to have a permanent pillar, right? Which is what the temple is going to be, right? While they're moving, you have the ark in a tent, right? And so the tent is like the moving pillar that you take down and you put up over and over and over again, and you're less committed to than when you build a city with city walls and have fields plowed and all of these things, right? Um,
Yeah, I think the key here though is to relate the top 3 points to the points below the diagram, right? Because it's saying the same thing twice, right? So in general, the powers of the staff are miniature representations of the power of the spatial axis. So this relies on understanding the spatial axis from the previous chapters, right? But it's the miniature representation, right? And so they're symbolizing the following ways in the context of the Bible, right? As a tool that establishes space by removing waters or halting time, right? That's number 1 below, establish space, remove waters. So this is still the staff, right? As a guidepost or shepherd staff that leads the group from exiles to homestead, right? That's leads home, bring out of exile, right? And as a pillar or cane that supports space against time, right? And so that's resisting of time. Now, what that means is that this staff is a fractal, smaller representation of that spatial axis. And in essence, I think the reason why he's using 3 is because, and I was thinking about this earlier, if there's an object in the world and you don't see 3 aspects for it like this, in, we'll say, 3 dimensions or something, or across 3 time frames, then either you're not seeing it correctly or it's a bad object, right? It's poorly named or something. It's incomplete. This idea of 3 aspects is super important, especially if you engage with like Plato, who got it from Pythagoras, to be fair to Pythagoras. But that's sort of the important part, is that 3 is super important here. There's 3 aspects to the staff. There's 3 ways in which it is a miniature representation of the spatial axis. And you have to recognize that, because you can't have an object that does one thing. That's not going to happen, right? You can't do one thing. It's not possible to do one thing. You may privilege one thing over all of the other things, and there may be more than 2 other things that thing does, but it's not only going to do one thing. And that's super important, right? Because that's the law of unintended consequences right there. It's a restatement of it. And that's why I think he puts the 3 things down here and then relates them to the diagram, right? And the diagram is something like the difference between chaos and proper order, right? In other words, order has to be seized, or it takes an action from your hand to create the order. I think that's the healthy way, we'll say, to think about it.
Yeah, I want to add. Okay.
I was thinking about this picture also. What you're doing in seizing the land is like the Israelites are supposed to go in, seize the land, and they're like refining it towards the telos, the glorifying God. That's what their general mission is, and God says, go and do this, and says, do this slowly over time so that you don't get taken over by the wild animals or whatever. And you can see the less of the Old Testament history on how well that goes for them. But
so a bunch of comments on this. I think you can also see it differently, right? So if you look at it in this framing, right, there's a initiation, right? There's a fleshing out, and then there's a fulfillment, right? So that's a day, right? Like you have the morning, you have the day, and you have the evening where you get at the end, right? So it's also a filling up, right? So if we want to have an enchanted world, we got to have the connection with these different purposes or different stages that come together to make something what it is, right? So like, for example, this pen needed to be made, then I write something with it, and then my writing has to do something in the world, and only then the pen has fully done its job. So I think it's interesting to look at it in that manner. You also, if we look at it at the exile thing, when they go to the promised land, there's like 2 people, I think that's Judea, right, that don't enter the promised land. They stay outside, right? So there's also a splitting up that precedes the settlement, right? And then there's the settlement itself, which is another splitting up, right? A complete splitting up. And so you can how do you say, well, like it's like a footprint or something, right? Or like a scatter where some things they hit the target, right? And some things get close to the target, but they never manifest the target, right? But they're still participating in the expression of the seed, right? And and that's how you also get diversification, right? Like there's different levels in which the start finds expression, the initial seed blossoms. And I want to go to this this picture because like we're not going to get to this picture, but I think the thing that I want to have everybody think about is there's the three layers, right? So you have the center, the head. It goes to the first layer, right, which is like the paradise, whatever, like the thing, the thing that holds the head, right? Then it gets fleshed out, and then it has a boundary with the external world, right? So that's the three things, right? And that's connecting it to four directions, right? So this is the union of 3 and 4, both really important numbers, right? Because 4 is talking about completeness, and 3 is talking about fullness, quantity and quality. And then you have the circle around it, which is talking about, well, the external influence, right? The time acting upon the body that is within time. So that's why I think it's a really universal picture where you can understand a lot of things from. And we'll talk more about that next week because we're going to close down. So I think I have 2 words here that we haven't gotten to, but they're really interesting. They're guidance and divination, right? So what makes Moses different? Well, is that he's a guide. Like he's being told by God, so he's not divining, right? He's receiving or something. Um, so he's in contact with the heavens, right? While other people look at the heavens and toss their lot, effectively. Um, so going into our reflection, and I'm sorry that I haven't engaged with the chat too much, but Mark always does that job for me, so that's really nice. Um, yeah, send your questions or insights in the chat so that we might spend some time in that. If we didn't pay attention to something that was important, please remind us so we give you full credit. So when we're reflecting, I want to have us look at the nature of guidance, right? Like what is the staff? How do we relate to it? And what's the proper relationship that we go through that, and like how does that connect back to the book club? And I'll see you guys on the other side. Well, who has something to share?
I think I'm in keeping with my title here. I'm not going to completely show my hand, I think, for next week. But because we stopped at the point that was talking about the supporting space against time and specifically halting time, which I'm going to keep some of that for next week. But since we're pausing here, I figured it was a little bit relevant. This aspect of, especially when you take something like a staff or a walking stick or something, creating that stability and keeping it in such a way that if you needed to rectify or address some sort of instability that, say, especially because walking is, I'm not going to oversimplify it like this, but if you don't walk correctly or if one leg is not doing its job correctly, you can easily fall. So you have this bit of like stopping time or stopping the overturning of yourself in your movement. But you also have this bit about the signal that you're giving to the people around you. If you're like a leader that is, say you're like a hiking guide or something like that, or you take something like a light post in the middle of the night. If someone is, for example, like if you have a dark parking lot or something like that, people are a lot less likely to try to pass through there. Whereas in many ways, the time is halted or held. Halt and hold are actually etymologically connected as well. That in many ways that parking lot would be kind of held by the light, and there's more stability there. Whereas, and you're not going to have as many animals kind of crossing through it or anything like that. So just a few little scattered things that came to mind as we pause here.
I got reminded by something that I should have shared with Mark because I was inside I had today or yesterday, and it's related to transitory rituals. Um, so I was talking about washing the hands or washing the feet, right? So another thing is taking off your shoes or wiping your shoes. Um, like what does that do? Take off your shoes. Well, that grounds you, right? Like you become connected to the ground, and having these things, having these intentional relationships, um, allows you to participate in a certain manner, right? So um, when we're talking about guidance, right, like we have to honor transitions that we're making, right? Like I think Castle was kind of pointing at the same thing, right? Like he was talking about it in the sense of creating space uh, for feedback, basically, right? Um, oh, I don't know where we're at, right? Or we should be doing this, right? Like, because that's basically what the gap does, right? It allows for a different sound, a different will to manifest. Um, so I think these things they can be refined, right? We can uh, discern different qualities, right? So this, but I'll connect that to the to the picture that we're going to talk about because I think they're all caught in that picture as well. Um, and then secondly, when there's leadership, there's a staff, right? Like I think we can kind of establish that now. And so we need to have a relationship to that staff, right? Like you need to have a relationship to that staff as a leader, right? You need to hold the staff high. You need to show it to people, um, and as someone being led, right? You need to be able to see the staff. You need to be able to hold on to the staff, right? Like, and that requires proper attention, right? So there's a because the staff is binding your attention, and we might be able to do some practices around that as well. I think because like you well you can see it with the ball thing, right? where they throw out the baseball, and you attend to the baseball. And you don't see the gorilla walk by, right? Like there's a way in that, like where that is a good thing, right? Because like else you would be distracted by by the gorilla, right? Like we don't want to be distracted by the gorilla. We want people that need to see the gorilla to see the gorilla, and everybody else do what they need to do. So yeah, that's what I got. And then, since we have no more contributions, I want to thank everybody for watching. I won't be there next week, so maybe we won't be there next week. I will have amazing family time and have a nice dinner. And yeah, thanks for watching, and see you on, at least not next week for me.